Well, welcome everyone. I'm delighted to see so many folks here with us.
It was your sermon.
It was my sermon. I'm not sure. I don't know. There are only two options, so there's going to be one place or the other. But for those of you who I haven't met, I'm Bruce McKay. I came to Western New York in 1989 to pastor program St. Luke's. I'm Richmond and West Utica, and I've been in New York City for 10 years prior to that at the Church of Living Hope in East Holland. And have really been blessed by being in Buffalo and through the years at Pilgrim St. Luke's. I also got involved with faith-based community organizing in the mid-90s, and it has really shaped my ministry in many ways. And how I've thought of it in terms of my own calling, actually, is that being a pastor has allowed me to love kindness, and by working in the faith-based organizing world, it's allowed me to do justice in my walk with God. And I think, and one of the reasons we're here today is, I'm not sure Pilgrim St. Luke's, I know it wouldn't be as vital a congregation today if we hadn't been introduced to faith-based organizing in the mid-90s. And I hope you have a better sense of why that might be the case at the end of our workshop.
And I'm Marianne Rathman. I've been in Buffalo my whole life and was in church education for 40 years. I'm retired from that. And Bruce got me into this today. We worked together for 20-some years at Pilgrim St. Luke's. And he was always getting me into things. One of the things he got me into was faith-based organizing. When he said to me, you need to go and get this training, he never told me to do something like that before. You must do this. And I thought, this must be important if he's telling me I must do this. Because he said, we got to be talking in the same language about ministry. And so we did it together, didn't we?
We did.
And it changed my whole way of looking at ministry, really. So here we are again.
Well, and how we've divided this up is I will sort of look at the why of liberation, what we're calling liberation listening, and Marianne will be looking at the how. We only have 45 minutes. At the New York conference, we'll be doing a similar workshop where we'll actually model how...
He needs it.
I need it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Marianne did.
Okay, yeah. I never was a teacher, so Marianne can use her teacher voice. I'll try to find my preacher voice here. But as I was saying, Marianne will be doing the how of this liberation listening, and I'll be doing the why. And one of the reasons I think this is important is because when I went to seminary, I was essentially trained to manage community. The courses I took, the relationships I built, the understanding was, and I felt called to be a pastor, I was taught to manage community from a very intellectual, academic, and in some ways, I guess, spiritual perspective. But today, unless clergy know how to create community, they're not going to have a community to manage. And this liberation listening became a way in my work at Pilgrim St. Luke's to begin to create community. And yeah, we don't go hand those out at the end. Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Don't look at it. Because you can't listen if you're looking. We're into listening today.
And the reason, I really don't need to say too much, I don't think, about why it's become essential to be able to create community. The statistics are very clear in terms of the diminishing church attendance, the lack of, especially young people, finding their way into pews on Sunday morning, the sense that there's so many other options out there and there's so much else going on in people's lives that they're not automatically in any way programmed to be in church on Sunday morning. So it becomes And I really think that community is, if not the, one of the most important gifts that we offer in our congregations, a sense of community. So it's critically important to be able to do this. And in terms of our need to do this, COVID has sort of upped the ante, I think, considerably. Far fewer people, I mean, from the pastors that I work with, both through a community of practice that I'm privileged to facilitate with some of you in the room, and we've been worshiping, my wife and I, at Trinity Episcopal Church after I left Pilgrim St. Luke's. It's become clear that the attendance in many congregations has diminished, and people's just aren't, now some of them may continue online, and it looks like moving into the future we will continue to be using the sort of hybrid model for worship. But generally there are far fewer people, or at least in many congregations, in the pews on Sunday morning. And some, I think, I've heard say that, well, people just get out of the habit. You know, you develop other habits during COVID, especially, and they're no longer in the habit of going to church, so they're not in a pew. They may still be worshiping online, but even that, in many ways, I think has probably diminished. But I would just raise the question as to whether or not there's diminishing attendance in many congregations because people have different habits, or because they're hurting in particular ways that they weren't before. In my experience as a pastor, often, unfortunately, when people were in the most pain, they were least likely to come to church. We weren't a place where they felt totally comfortable or confident bringing their pain into the life of the community. That wasn't always the case, but in many cases, as I went through years in the parish, I realized how common that was. And I suspect that a lot of people aren't in pews now because of the pain they're in personally, and that their families are in, as opposed to just the fact they're out of the habit of coming to church. And I think so that increases the need to be able to somehow create community, or create a community that is welcoming of the entire person, including their pain, into its life, and people feel that it's a safe place to be, and an important place for them to move through through whatever they're experiencing, and to become more fully faithful as disciples of Jesus. So this situation that I think many of us find ourselves in is continuing to sort of play itself out in many of our congregations. And as we move forward here, I just highlight that there are a few assumptions that Marianne and I are making in talking about this liberation listening. The first is that everyone in some significant way is hurting, starving, to use the metaphor we used this morning in terms of the famine of hearing God's word. I heard I was on a Zoom call recently with a Buddhist Christian monk, a black Buddhist Christian monk, who was talking about the trauma basically we all experience through birth, through coming from the womb into the world. This sort of existential trauma is part of our human experience, and all of us add in different ways other elements of trauma. And that helped me sort of as an image of how all of us in some ways are hurting. And So that's one of the assumptions, or all of us are wounded, to use another term. So that's one of the assumptions that Marianne and I have in looking at this. Another is that the people sitting in our pews really don't know each other as well as we might like to think they do. I've talked to a number of pastors recently who've just said, it's just come up in the conversation, you know, my people don't really know each other. They talk about themselves as family in many cases, but they don't know each other as well as they think they do, or as well as I would hope they would. So that's the second assumption. And the third assumption is that in listening to one another, in some very real way, we're listening to God, or to the Spirit at work in someone's life. Anyone here in your parish work or experience work with unwrapping our gifts? A ministry, a program, Gary did.
A long time.
Faith, faith. Well, this is age. Yeah, definitely showing my age here.
Another lifetime.
Yeah, another lifetime. But that was, we started doing that at Pilgrim Statements before we discovered faith-based organizing or intentional relationship building as a tool for doing that. And actually Faith and I, or Faith was one of the leaders of this group, and it really was a way to, the conviction was that all of us are gifted, and it was a small group experience that enabled people to identify their spiritual gifts, and in so doing get clearer about what it meant to live the life God had created them to live. And the format for that was small groups, and it was essentially rooted in listening to one another, listening to Scripture, but listening to one another in a process that helped people hear how God was working in their own life and in the lives of those they were participating in the program with. So that was a very helpful reminder and opportunity for seeing that in this intentional relationship building based on listening, we're not only listening to the person themselves, but in some ways listening to the Spirit speak, listening to our still speaking God speak through that. And the other assumption is that in some ways the practice of intentional listening is liberating not only for the person being listened to, but for the listener. One of the people at Pilgrim St. Luke's, when we were in the midst of doing these intentional conversations, said, when I feel listened to, it's like being loved. It's like feeling loved. So it's been my experience and my conviction, really, that if we're listening with our heart as well as our ears, it can be living sort of a liberating opportunity, both for the person that we're listening to as they share their story, and for us as we work to somehow not only hear how God's at work in their life, it helps reveal how God may have been at work in our life as well. So that is sort of a bit of the why. I guess I'd just like to ask, before Marianne steps up here, I'm not sure, we're going to keep time for one. How are we doing here, Marianne?
It's 11:30, and I think we're going to go to noon.
Yeah, okay. Okay, good.
I think we're good.
Yeah, well, I might just invite a little bit of reaction to your response. As in terms of this notion of when we're being listened to, we're feeling loved. Can anyone speak to an experience either you've had or observed with that in your own life? When somebody's been listening to you, you feel being loved. It happened to me with a college friend, good friend from college. We were visiting him several years after we graduated. My father had had a heart attack and he was about to have bypass surgery. And this friend was a surgeon, a young surgeon. And I can remember sitting in his home, and we just finished dinner, and he took a napkin, a paper napkin. We were sitting there at the dinner table, and he began drawing on the napkin what happens when somebody receives bypass surgery. And I can remember still just sitting there, and it wasn't really just the information he was sharing, but in a sense he was sharing his love for me. I felt loved in his sharing with me his knowledge about what happens when somebody undergoes this type of surgery. I mean, anyone else, when you felt listened to in terms of feeling loved? Yes?
Well, in the basic, first of all, it's good to be here. I've learned over the years of being married, listening to my wife. So
Amen to that.
Happy wife, happy life.
It's a happy wife, happy life. But you know what? It's so interesting that when we listen to one another, I had to really learn to stop listening to her for a debate and really listen to her to understand where she was coming from.
Right.
Because truthfully, men and women, no kidding, think totally different. Men are from Mars,
women are Venus, right, yeah.
But I do understand what happened was, and sometimes in the competition of spouses winning arguments, it wasn't important for me to win the argument as it was to understand what she needed. And then she'd understand what I needed. We had to come and meet in the middle, because there is compromise depending on where our convictions are or how we stand and how we see things. But I learned how to not listen to win the fight, because I could have won the fight, but I lost my wife.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So they say that marriage is the only war where you sleep with the enemy.
Where you sleep with the enemy.
Marriage, I've heard marriage is the only war where you sleep with the enemy. That's a joke.
Well, yeah, that.
But I can appreciate learning how to communicate with her in a better way. And over the years, our relationship has grown better because I've come with an open mind instead of listening to have a better comeback.
Right. And yeah, that's an essential, that's a wonderful example. And I suggest an essential element of this liberation listening, and that is the fact that you are fully listening. You're really not just thinking about your response. Yes. You're not just anticipating what you're going to say to win the argument or win the day or to make a better point. It's trying to be as fully open to hearing what is being said as you possibly can. So no, that's really helpful. Anyone else?
I don't have a story, but Marianne, I need to tell you we're going to be done at 11:45.
Oh,
11:45.
well, no, that was the old time, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think we've got another 15
See, she
minutes.
changed the times.
Okay.
Yeah. So, unless your stomachs are really, we're going to go till noon. Okay. If you need to leave, if you feel you need to leave, leave.
But that said, it's time for Marianne.
Okay. I'm not going to use a mic unless you really feel like I need it. Let me know, okay? So what are the elements of listening as a spiritual practice? Liberation listening. What we did at our church at two different times is set a time for listening. We called it a listening campaign. So everybody knew we were going to spend a month, 6 weeks, whatever it was a set time, that we were going to do this listening campaign. And Bruce spoke from the pulpit about it. We put it in the newsletter. We told everybody, you're going to get a call. And somebody is going to have a conversation with you and listen to you. And it was so interesting because we had some people who didn't get calls right away and said, when am I going to get my call? Which was kind of cool. So we trained about 17 people in listening. And through this time period, We listened to about 85 people. They were mostly the people who come regularly, who we think we know, who are active, who attend worship, and we had a limited number of people to do it. So we had to, kind of keep that. Everybody had about 4 to 6 people that they actually chose. We sat down with the people we trained, had the whole list of our congregation there, and they chose the people they would like to have a one-on-one with. 1-to-1. We've changed it from one-on-one to 1-to-1. Listening happens in a 1-to-1 focused interaction. Very intentional. You make an appointment with the person. Sometimes that's the hardest part to do, is to get an appointment, to find a time when you can get together. Some met in coffee shops, some people invited you into their home, but you make a time for it. They say, a half an hour. I never could do a one-on-one in half an hour, but I tried to limit it to an hour, and that seemed to work. So the goal is to create or deepen a relationship by better understanding the uniqueness of that person that God has created. So the listener asks a series of questions, open-ended questions, that allow the other person to tell their story. It's amazing how many people have never had a chance to tell their story. And so people love doing it. Sometimes you have to kind of cut them off a little bit. They want to tell you more and more. And others you had to, draw things out of them. And what is important to them. Some of the questions, and we did it at 2 different times, some of the questions were things like, after you ask them about themselves a little bit, where are you from, where did you grow up, just basic who are you questions. But that is the least important of this. What brings you the greatest joy? Or what is your toughest challenge at this time in your life? A time you recently felt God's presence or absence. And then questions maybe about the church. How long have you been a member in this church? Did you grow up in this church? When did you come to this church? How many years have you been a member? Why have you stayed at our church? What do you like about the church? We got a lot of information about how people were feeling about the church. Some that was very revealing, and some that was, we expected. What would you like to see changed in our church? What are your hopes for our congregation? Those kinds of things. And then things like, what does community mean to you? What do you like about the church community? Or beyond the church, in the neighborhood? How do you think this neighborhood around our church could be improved? Because we wanted to, at that time, we were thinking about how we could relate to our neighborhood a little bit more. Or what would you change? So those kinds of questions is what we ask. Let me find my notes here. So we're gaining clarity about who this person is, what they're feeling about things, and the bottom, what you really want to get into is, how do they see God calling them? Or what do they see God calling them to at this time in their life? And a lot of them hadn't really thought about it that way. So that was very revealing for a lot of folks. There's 2 attitudes we bring to this. curiosity. What are you curious about this person? When they tell you something, see if you can, the other attitude is courage. See if you can get them, probe them to go a little bit deeper into what they're telling you. Especially if they get filled up about something, or they get real excited about something, then you know there's something going on inside a little bit more about what they're telling you. So you make an appointment, limit your interaction to about an hour, I would say at the most. At the end, you can even invite them to give you some feedback. How did this feel for you to share this with me? And then, and only then, you leave and make notes. Do not take notes during the conversation because you're not truly listening then. So you want to kind of, as you're listening, think about what you want to write down afterwards. And we found that our congregation, and Faith was part of this too, became so close as a community. We were really community. The coffee hours were much louder. Instead of talking about the bills and the weather, we were talking about deeper things. You know, how is your daughter? What's going on with her? You know, or how did you get that done that you were telling me about? You know, those kinds of things. So that we really got to know one another on a much deeper level. I grew up, you know, in churches that I thought I knew people really well, but I really didn't. You know, I looked at the back of their heads more than anything in worship. And so often we go to church, we, you know, greet people, we sit through worship, we have a little coffee together afterwards. Now, we might be in some small groups together where this kind of thing happens. But having a one-to-one conversation is very powerful. And it helps the person to get clarity about things in their own life. And it helped me to get clarity about things in my life. So that a person, I remember people saying, oh, I just told you that. I never really thought about it that way. Or I never really thought about that experience in my life affecting what I am today. So how is God speaking in your life is something that people really got clarity about. And what is God calling you to do at this time in your life? You know, after I retired, it was really important for me to have people listen to how I was feeling about not working regularly anymore. And what was God calling me to do now? And it was really important for Bruce to listen to me about that, or other people. So yeah, this was very transforming to our church community. And now I will take questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Marianne, so I understand this as wonderfully connecting. How is it liberating? You know, this is called liberation and listening.
Well, because it liberates the person to discover how God is working in them. So that's the liberating part. Is maybe they never even thought about it before, but for them to get clarity about that is very liberating. And I found it very liberating for me to have this sacred conversation with this person. For me to, wow, you know, I didn't know Jamie that well before, but Jamie has shared, you know, very personal things about her health to me that she's going through. And that's a sacred, you know, exchange. Yeah.
I'm really putting you on the spot, Faith, but would you be comfortable just sort of sharing how being listened to maybe you experienced some
Changed
major
my life.
liberation?
Nice and loud.
Being listened to changed my life, and where I was in deep pain and had, I was in deep pain and had a lot of PTSD, and yes, it felt like being loved, and that was basically being listened to by both Bruce and Marianne, and allowing me to then listen to others. I was also thinking when you were talking, in a lot of our churches, we don't really talk about God, or we drop the God, we kind of lower our voice. It allowed me to talk about God in a more direct and personal way, which was liberating. And I became a minister out of this listening, so be careful. Take a little aid.
And actually, in a way, another extension of that was it enabled us at Pilgrim St. Luke's to be evangelical.
Yeah.
UCC folks tend to know how to knock on doors, but not to know what to say when people answer it. We actually were knocking on doors in our neighborhood, but it was all about listening. What's it like to be here? How long have you been here? What do you know about the church? And then invite them to a meeting at the church within a week where they could hear any concerns raised by themselves or their neighbors. And then, see, part of this has this justice component or this service component too.
Yeah.
This term, I'll just say, liberation listening, like a lot of preachers, I borrow most of, rather than steal, I guess is a more comfortable word. I borrow a lot of things from a lot of different people, and this term is from Otis Moss III, the pastor at
His new book.
Dancing in the Darkness, pastor at Trinity UCC in Chicago. He uses the term. It's especially liberating, or it's liberating in a different way, when the listening is happening, say, between me and a woman, or me and an African American, or me and anybody who's different than I am. If I'm really listening, and they have the courage to be honest and open, and I have the grace to hear them, it can be a measure of liberation happens when people sort of break free from all the sort of the straitjacket of oppression that's out there in the world in a lot of different ways. So that would require maybe another workshop to answer fully Scott's question. But it's a good one. But I'm very comfortable with this notion of it being liberating listening that we're engaged with, because it basically helps liberate people into becoming who they were created and called to be. And not that it's miraculous in every conversation you're hearing, and listening is important. I mean, we suggest that you just speak no more than 20% of the time. When we're doing this, such a tendency to want to react to or say something in response to what somebody has said. So we really are trying to keep the focus on listening.
Without telling your culture.
And you can always, and Marianne, I maybe was a little better than Marianne. The reason we say 30 minutes is it sort of forces you to be clear and the person to be clear.
Exactly.
And it is challenging. It can be done, but it's challenging to do. But and it also forces you to be the listener, not the speaker. Yes, Jamie.
You had brought up about going door to door to help improve the community around us so that we can service them better. What other options that would you give as opposed to that, considering the climate today where people are just knocking on doors?
Yeah, or getting shot if they drive into the wrong driveway. Yeah, that's a very.
And then you also
question.
get into the soliciting gray
Yeah.
area.
Well, no, it's interesting to think how, we were doing that in the 90s and how different the world is now. Carefully. I mean, it would be one thing. I mean, I don't know. It would be interesting to try to decide how do we connect.
We could do mailers, but then that's an added cost.
Yeah,
So,
and
and that's not
it really is all about the relationship.
Yeah.
It's all about the relationship. So, Yeah,
No alternative ideas?
It wasn't just one person, two people we'd go in pairs, 2 by 2. So that may,
But that was another thing beyond the listening within the.
right, that was a whole.
That was another whole.
Sort of project. Yes, yeah.
That may be an alternative for that. Attend community events in your area and reach out to people there instead of going
Yeah.
door to door.
Right.
Like when Canal Fest is here,
Sure.
we get out
Sure.
there and
Yep.
meet the
Be
people in the
visible.
community.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's a very good example, and an opportunity to build a relationship or just starting up a conversation and maybe invite that person for coffee or whatever as a way to follow up.
We
Yes,
have community events too at our church, like a summer community picnic,
Right.
where we have free hot dogs and
Yeah.
potato salad and stuff.
yeah, we had a strawberry
And the
festival
Latin
for
lunches,
years.
we offer free lunches for 8 weeks on
Yeah.
Fridays.
And it's amazing how you can just, as somebody's eat, you probably have a place to eat for people to eat.
Well,
It's
before
just-
COVID we did, now
yeah,
it's
okay.
drive-through.
Yeah, but you can just sit down with people
Yeah.
and just start conversation.
Right.
And it's amazing, you can just ask one question, you live in this, how long have you lived in this community? And they'll just, all of a sudden, you've had a little relationship building there.
Right, we've done that, like, even with the drive-through with the Lenten lunches,
Yeah,
you talk
yeah.
to the people when you get
Yeah,
them their
good.
lunch and stuff.
Good, yeah.
Yeah, that's one way to reach the community.
Right.
And we would always try to work into the conversation that we're also open on Sunday morning.
Yeah. We have a little, they put a little flyer in the bag.
Right, we do
Lunches,
too.
People, a woman who ended up helping out the church in all sorts of ways. And we had people connect with the life of the church through this process of going out into the neighborhood. It didn't always happen, and that wasn't the main reason for doing it, but it did profile the church in a way that was helpful and I think healthy for the congregation as a community that was interested in the community beyond its walls.
Another thing that came out of this is we found out what people are really interested in and their gifts.
Right.
So that when it was time to put people on, to get people on committees and boards and that kind of
Yeah.
thing, is we really thought about, hey, this person really has a gift for this particular thing. Let's ask them. They've never been asked before because we didn't know,
Yeah,
Now we
that's
know.
really key.
That was very key. That was very
just
key.
to know people well enough and their interests well enough to, in a way, to invite them into the life of the community based on their interests, because you know their interests and what's important to them.
And that's just a way of inviting people to succeed and not fail. Because when you just randomly pick a committee,
Yeah.
the person will go, oh yeah, I can serve, and then they flub it,
Right.
and they don't want to even
Right.
come to the church then,
Right,
because
right.
they're embarrassed.
Yeah.
So it was setting people up for success when they serve.
Good point.
Yeah, and it also created an opportunity for people to act on their own interests. We tried to create a culture where if somebody felt called to do something,
Yeah.
they were invited to do it and supported in doing it. We started a program called Never Stop Learning, that one of our members worked with the arts and people with intellectual and physical disabilities. And the church was able to play a part in helping that happen. There's a...
One thing that I have learned through the years, we went to a retreat at Dunkirk and this came out, and I've done it ever since. If someone asks you to be on a committee, you ask them, why is it that you want me to? What gifts do you want me to bring to this committee?
Right.
I had never done that.
Yeah, that's a
over the
good-
years, and this is a real
good
eye
question.
opener.
Could you hear that back there? Did you get that? Yeah.
Anyone else? Ruth, yeah.
Who got the notes, or what did you do with the notes? You said you took notes.
Oh, yeah. Let me just say also, one of the things we share with the person is this is very confidential. Whatever you tell me is confidential. Then, by the end, may I share these interests that you have with our committee? May I share, these kinds of things? So that, and we also discovered in some instances that people were going through a lot of pain. I would say, may I share that with Pastor Bruce? would you like him to call you or whatever? So then we would pass those deeper things, because we're not counselors, obviously, we pass those on to Bruce and say, but with their permission. But we kept the notes kind of as a leadership team, and we gave them to the leadership team, which we call our board in our church, and used it. It might be committees, it might be stewardship, it might be whatever, so it was shared that way. But we always told them it was confidential unless we asked them.
One important element that Marianne didn't highlight is we call this team that initially did this at Pilgrim of St. Luke's the Vision Team.
Vision team.
Because, I've been there a few years, and the church had a certain sense of its vision, of what God was trying to get done through them, but it wasn't as clear as it could have been. So we called this a Vision Team, and used it as an opportunity to get clearer about what is God's vision for our community, our faith community. And so the information that was gathered through this conversation in terms of things like what you really like about Pilgrim St. Luke's, what might you change if you could, what's missing, that sort of information got shared anonymously. But people would be sitting at the 2 or 3 community meetings that followed and say, that was my idea. Or, I said that, And out of that process, we described ourselves as a community that is Christ-centered. These are aspirational terms, not that we've arrived and that we're fully who God created us to be. Our conversion is continuous, sort of thing. But we're a community that is Christ-centered, works to be Christ-centered, inclusive, and committed to following God's reign. So, and then we just translated that into a mission statement. Our mission at Pilgrim St. Luke's is to grow disciples of Jesus by building an inclusive community of faith committed to making a difference in the world. So that clarity around our vision, I think, was key also, because when people were asked, a member said, well, geez, tell me about your church. They had something to say, or they had, not that everyone would have had something to say before, but people were saying the same thing. This is who we are, and or who we're trying to become more fully. And to just tie it back, it is about community. We are better together. We can't be fully who God is calling us to be individually unless we're connected with a community where others are doing the same. Because in a very real way, I had this sense that I couldn't be the pastor God was calling me to be unless Faith was becoming the person, in her case, a pastor that God was calling her to be, or anyone else in the congregation. We talk about church community as the body of Christ with many gifts. The body's disabled significantly if people aren't clear about their gifts and have the courage to act on them. So we try to become healthier and more fully able in that sense as well.
I do have a handout. If you would like to, there's some more here. And the handout is basically what I share with you. Bruce and my information is at the bottom of it. If you would like to contact us for more information or to help you, if you want to set up a listening team, we would be happy to share that. But I would just like to close.
Yeah, before you do, I just want to say we will be at the New York conference and actually model this conversation one-to-one, and then invite some reaction to that and that experience. Because I realize that we haven't had the chance to do everything we hoped to do. And I would like to say too, I will be working with the Better Together congregations to more fully introduce this practice and give them the opportunity to engage in listening to one another and to listening within their congregation. And we'll see where the Spirit leads us.
Okay, I just want to end, and if you feel comfortable, close your eyes. I'm going to read a quote from Otis Moss's book on liberation listening. Otis says, Reverend Dr. Otis Moss, our deliverance comes when we both can listen. Each needs to hear the other crying out. Each needs to respond not to the surface accusations or despair, but to the underlying source of pain, while at the same time acknowledging their own situation, their own feelings. Listening of this kind, liberation listening, turns dialogue into a spiritual practice. It requires both sides to have faith that if we will truly listen, then your liberation will be my liberation, and mine will contribute to yours. Thank you for coming.
Amen. Thank you.